¿Qué tal amigos? Bienvenidos a la clase número 238. Hoy te traigo una clase muy práctica. Vamos a hablar acerca de los superlativos y este es el video número 4. En esta clase tenemos muchos ejemplos de superlativos con adjetivos largos. Por ejemplo, delicious, more delicious than, and the most delicious. Espero que disfrutes de esta presentación.
Intelligent. More intelligent than, the most intelligent. Less intelligent than, the least intelligent. Amazing. More amazing than, the most amazing. Less amazing than, the least amazing. Ancient. More ancient than, the most ancient. Less ancient than, the least ancient. Anxious. More anxious than, the most anxious. Less anxious than, the least anxious. Appealing. More appealing than, the most appealing. Less appealing than, the least appealing.
Arrogant. More arrogant than, the most arrogant. Less arrogant than, the least arrogant. Attractive. More attractive than, the most attractive. Less attractive than, the least attractive. Awful. More awful than, the most awful. Less awful than, the least awful. Bad-tempered. More bad-tempered than, the most bad-tempered. Less bad-tempered than, the least bad-tempered. Beautiful. More beautiful than, the most beautiful. Less beautiful than, the least beautiful.
Boring. More boring than, the most boring. Less boring than, the least boring. Brilliant. More brilliant than, the most brilliant. Less brilliant than, the least brilliant. Careful. More careful than, the most careful. Less careful than, the least careful. Careless. More careless than, the most careless. Less careless than, the least careless. Cheerful. More cheerful than, the most cheerful. Less cheerful than, the least cheerful.
Childish. More childish than, the most childish. Less childish than, the least childish. Colorful. More colorful than, the most colorful. Less colorful than, the least colorful. Comfortable. More comfortable than, the most comfortable. Less comfortable than, the least comfortable. Commercial. More commercial than, the most commercial. Less commercial than, the least commercial. Complicated. More complicated than, the most complicated. Less complicated than, the least complicated.
Confident. More confident than, the most confident. Less confident than, the least confident. Confused. More confused than, the most confused. Less confused than, the least confused. confusing. More confusing than, the most confusing. Less confusing than, the least confusing. Controversial. More controversial than, the most controversial. Less controversial than, the least controversial. Creative. More creative than, the most creative. Less creative than, the least creative.
Crowded. More crowded than, the most crowded. Less crowded than, the least crowded. Dangerous. More dangerous than, the most dangerous. Less dangerous than, the least dangerous. Delicious. More delicious than, the most delicious. Less delicious than, the least delicious. Delightful. More delightful than, the most delightful. Less delightful than, the least delightful. Determined. More determined than, the most determined. Less determined than, the least determined.
Different. More different than, the most different. Less different than, the least different. Difficult. More difficult than, the most difficult. Less difficult than, the least difficult. Diligent. More diligent than, the most diligent. Less diligent than, the least diligent. Disgusting. More disgusting than, the most disgusting. Less disgusting than, the least disgusting. Dreadful. More dreadful than, the most dreadful. Less dreadful than, the least dreadful.
Easygoing. More easygoing than, the most easygoing. Less easygoing than, the least easygoing. Efficient. More efficient than, the most efficient. Less efficient than, the least efficient. Elegant. More elegant than, the most elegant. Less elegant than, the least elegant. Embarrassed. More embarrassed than, the most embarrassed. Less embarrassed than, the least embarrassed. Enjoyable. More enjoyable than, the most enjoyable. Less enjoyable than, the least enjoyable.
Special. More special than, the most special. Less special than, the least special. Exciting. More exciting than, the most exciting. Less exciting than, the least exciting. Expensive. More expensive than, the most expensive. Less expensive than, the least expensive. Famous. More famous than, the most famous. Less famous than, the least famous. Fascinating. More fascinating than, the most fascinating. Less fascinating than, the least fascinating.
Recuerda, suscríbete totalmente gratis a este canal. Comenta y comparte. Regálame un like o un me gusta. Activa la campanita de notificaciones. Por favor, apoya nuestro canal con tus donaciones en la cuenta de PayPal. Aquí abajo te dejo el enlace. Mi nombre es Raúl Joven León. Mi correo electrónico personal rjoven66@gmail.com. Me encantaría recibir noticias tuyas.